It's good that you took some time to meet with me. How you doing?
Oh, I'm doing really well, Anelia. Thank you for having me on.
Sure thing. So I wanted to ask, how's the book going?
The book is going pretty well. For those of you who don't know, I'm working on a novella called Dreadnought, which is sort of a giant robot teen pilot thing. And it's a psychological and body horror book. And it's sort of all about the idea of this genre of piloting robots as a way to discuss proxy bodies and not belonging in your own skin.
That's pretty cool. It kind of
Thank you.
conjures the image of Evangelion, which just recently came back on Netflix. What are the
Yeah.
inspirations for this series?
So Evangelion, obviously, I know is really formative to me and a lot of other trans women I've known because it's this series about such intense discomfort and self-loathing and isolation. And another prominent inspiration is Charity Hardscape Porpentine's Psycho Nymph Exile, which itself is sort of this hyper violent sort of what's that Japanese genre guro where everything is like really intensely grotesque on purpose send up of giant mecha shows and magical girl stuff. And I just think there's something really potent in all that, the desperation of the escapism in those genres.
Yeah, I mean, it's very visceral stuff when you look at it because a lot of horror, at least Western horror that I've seen, comes from an angle where it's very emotionally removed and it relies on
Yeah.
its shock value heavily. But with
Yeah.
with your work and with a lot of the works that seem to inspire it, a big emphasis is placed on the emotional investment into it. And so then the preceding like insanity that comes after has that much more punch to it.
Thank you. I'm really glad you feel that way. It's certainly something I try for. When I look at Western horror, like you were talking about, so much of it is sort of about violation and correction of the status quo. And I don't think that's very interesting. I don't think it's interesting to come at horror from this sort of like suburban liberal perspective that our American dream is under threat. And I'm much more interested in the individual experience of horror and in what systems do to people than I am in reaffirming the things we believe in
Mm-hmm.
and manufacturing this sense of social safety.
Mm-hmm. Well, in your mind then, how would you say is a or what is a good approach to come at horror from then? What's a unique perspective that can be taken on it?
I think the way that I try to approach horror is as a lens through which to look at things about myself and about my world that I would rather not see or spend time with. Horror is a chance to hold ugliness in your arms. And I think that's really crucial, both to our understanding of art as something that can and must challenge us, and frankly, to our own personal growth. You have to be able to spend time with things that make you uncomfortable if you ever want to expand your mindset or learn new things.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the one of the major themes about all of this seems to be giving sort of a message of not just raw terror, but sort of a catharsis therein, in that, finding some sort of beauty in the whole mess.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're definitely right about that in terms of how I approach horror. I think really often about Robert Eggers's recent movie, The Witch, and about how if you look at it in a certain way, the whole movie is really about the point where this married Puritan couple living out on the frontier with no support from their community are lying in bed together, discussing what to do now that the harvest has failed and they're facing possible starvation. And the husband is holding the wife and he says, "Dost thou not remember that I love thee?" And it's so quiet and the lighting is so gentle And it just makes everything that comes after that, once the movie really descends into violence and insanity, so much harder to take, because you know these people really do love each other. And it's just that the way they've learned to express it and the society around which their lives are structured can't deal with that love, can't tolerate it. They, in trying to love one another, they rip each other apart. I think that is first and foremost, of course, sad and dispiriting, but it's also beautiful. It's showing us that even in total failure, there are some of humanity's best traits.
And I think that's kind of interesting too. You know, we're both trans, and I think that one common thread that runs throughout our community, at least when we approach horror, is that, as you were saying, like the reaffirmation of, you know, our suburban norms, you know, that kind of is horror to us. And we sort of we find refuge in the strange and the, you know, abnormal. And so writing horror for a, you know, LGBT minority, you know, trans audience, you know, you have to take a completely different approach. And, you know, I just want to ask this one more time, because I'm only partially sure I understand, is like, how does approaching horror for this group of people differ from what everyone believes is the status quo?
That's an interesting question. I don't often think of myself as writing explicitly only for other trans people or other lesbians. But they're certainly on my mind all the time, because I am one. And I'm surrounded by them too. And it's a community that has meant so much to me and has really helped me form an adult self. So I suppose when I'm making horror and when I'm trying to think about what is frightening to me personally and what are the parts of my own life that I don't want to look at, I think that any marginalized person can empathize with the experience of being inherently unwantable and unlovable. Those are very frightening, isolating feelings. And for gay and trans people, it's so common to encounter those feelings from your own parents, from your siblings, from your family, from your friends even. And I think that is a really unique part of our experience of horror as a community, is that a lot of the safety other people take for granted is something that we have a tremendous amount of insecurity around. You know, community is hard won when you're like we are.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something I try and keep in mind, and I try to keep especially the very long and difficult relationship I've had with my own body and the ways that I see it and the things that I have done to it and want to do to it, because it's a tremendously visceral experience to have over time, and something that I think has really been shaped by my experience loving horror. I remember before I came out watching The Thing for the first time, and just the sight of flesh moving like that and resculpting itself was very moving and transformative for me. So there's this sense of uncomfortable physicality that I try to keep at the forefront of my work, because it's so central to my experience of daily life. You know, on top of all the usual crap, I also have body dysmorphic disorder, which causes you to have these kind of sustained and obsessive hallucinations about your body. So it's something I have a lot of experience with. I'm sorry if that was a big looping answer, but that's about as close as I can get.
Oh, no. Looping answer is fine. As long as you get what you feel is, like, you know, the answer to yourself out here. You know, this isn't a show on science, so, you know, there's no one right answer to any question that I ask on here.
I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate that.
Another thing I'm kind of curious is, you described sort of almost a guru type theme to what you're doing. How do you make sure it doesn't cross a line? Like, how do you ensure you haven't gone too far with the descriptions, or you've made things a little bit too difficult to be absorbed?
Well, with my last book, Ego Homini Lupus, which is about a young woman who is married off to a Norman knight in the 12th century and who loses her mind trying to deal with the extreme burden of keeping up his dilapidated estate. I think probably there are parts of that book that are deeply unpalatable to most people. And I've just come to a place in my life where I accept that my work is not for everyone and that people are always going to read it, and some portion of them will react to it with disgust or anger. And that's okay with me. I don't mind that. It really has nothing to do with me as far as I'm concerned. So I guess, in short, I don't think about it.
I mean, that's all right. There are many niche genres out there, and someone to fill them all.
Right. And I definitely think of myself as much more part of that than any kind of mainstream horror. I don't think my horror novels will ever have a big audience, and I'm really okay with that.
I think that honestly, there's something kind of beautiful to be found in a sort of small cult following, because with that,
you can do things that would never be acceptable in more mainstream media.
Exactly. You don't get the criticism levied at you that you would get with a bigger following, and you get to explore topics that are, like this, sort of taboo to talk about in, wider context. So this show is kind of about the philosophy of collaborative storytelling. And you are an author of sort of, non-collaborative storytelling. You tell, your own focus stories. How do you think, publishing and mono storytelling compare, and how do they sort of interact with something like collaborative storytelling?
Well, I think that many of the skills involved in both are transferable. Once you know the basic architecture of a story, it's much easier to think on your feet as a DM or a player in a tabletop game. And I've always found tabletop games to be a huge source of inspiration in terms of unexpected twists and imagery, because you have to generate so much on the fly that you're going to inevitably get out of your comfort zone. But primarily, collaborative storytelling to me is communal, and it's about bonding with other people. And I think that's something that people who have a solitary profession, I work from home, I'm a full-time writer, that we really need. And it's certainly, I've been a DM for 10 years, and largely with the same group of people. And playing Dungeons and Dragons was really what cemented us as a friend group and allowed us to stay together well after most other circles of college friends around us had broken up and gone their separate ways. And that's been a really special experience for me. I think that that's so valuable if you can have that through Dungeons and Dragons or whatever tabletop game you might play with your friends. And I think, and this might sound a little corny, but I think that the emotional support and community and affection of a game like that that's long running and regular can really help support you as a writer, and can teach you a lot about connecting with people, which is ultimately what all stories are about anyway.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's kind of a beautiful sentiment.
Thank you.
And I'm kind of
Yeah.
curious. So you write horror and you DM. You know, what are your games like? Do you interject sort of the horror that you're known for into your game experiences, or what kind of style do you have?
Well, I make my own game worlds, and I do a lot of homebrew stuff. And I would say that all my campaigns have some element of horror because it's what I'm most interested in and most familiar with. But there are things you can't or wouldn't want to do at a table with your friends that are,
Of course,
more integral to writing on your own. So I would say that yeah, my games do include horror elements, and I do think that a certain amount of fear and tension at the table can be really fun for everyone. It can be exciting, but it's definitely less intense and less, especially like less sexual than it is in my books.
are you familiar with the campaign setting Ravenloft?
Only very vaguely. I know it's sort of like a gothic campaign setting, right?
Mm-hmm. I was wondering like what your relationship to a setting like that is, or if you've looked at it all.
No, I haven't. I usually use the Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 rules and just build my own world.
3.5. That's mad respect for you for keeping that one up for how long has that been out of print?
Oh, geez. 15, 20 years? 15, I think. Because I think the last book's released right as I was getting into college. So that was 2006 or 7.
Mm-hmm. So how do you get 3.5 books if if they're no longer in print, or if you need more resources?
Well, first of all, I definitely acquire them all completely legally, and I have never downloaded a Dungeons and Dragons book, and I do not recommend that you do that either. And I'm winking now, which you can't see because this is a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said earlier, a lot of what I do, I generate on my own. So really the core rules are enough for me.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, to be honest, I have never met a person who plays completely off of, a prefab setting, in that
Right.
most everyone I've met either has their own custom world or a heavily modified version of an existing one.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Why
where
do you,
some of the fun is. That's
yeah.
where so much of the fun is.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the creative process is kind of why we are all here.
Right.
So now I'm sort of curious, as someone who's been DMing for a long time and someone who's been writing for a long time, what are some tips you would offer to aspiring DMs or writers?
Oh boy. So I don't seek out or give writing advice very regularly, but I do have one or two things that I'm always happy to repeat and share with other people, and they can take them or leave them as they want. When it comes to games, the most central piece of advice is that A, you should really only do it with people you like and love, because it's just no fun otherwise. B, you are not competing with them, you are playing with them. Do not try to beat your players.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to writing, I begin and end with this. Try to write 500 words a day. That's all.
I can respect that.
If pushed, I suppose I would get into the slightly more esoteric waters of saying that you really, really, really should not worry about how your work is going to be received.
Okay, cool. So thanks for having you on.
No worries.